over her 11 years, the gap between the richest 10% and the poorest 10% in this country has widened substantially.
Mr. Speaker, all levels of income are better off than they were in 1979. Yes, he would rather have the poor poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That is a Liberal policy. Once they start to talk about the gap, they'd rather the gap were that. Down here. That. Not that. But that.
Down there. Okay, folks, you're not asking for 3 more minutes of rehash of everything you've already heard about Margaret Thatcher, all the analysis of the superficial, the self-evident, the drop-dead obvious stuff. So let's dispense with all of it and just go to some Canadian common sense. Look, everyone in the country knows that there are no Margaret Thatchers in the world stage right now for a real simple human reason. She was unique. She was special. She was exceptional. I can't tell you why so many so-called news analysts and pundits and other inflated talking heads can't simply get their arms around that. They keep dwelling on things like polls and saying things like, well, you know, today's leaders take polls on everything. A poll before an important policy speech or a foreign trip or a budget. And they don't wish to say things, these leaders, that divide people too much, that polarize them too much. So they try to serve it up nice and gentle so as to offend the least amount of people. Oh, please. Spare me the obvious. That's what timid politicians do, of course. Practically take a poll before they even have their first morning cup of coffee, before they have lunch, before they clear their throats. We know that. It's because they're timid. We know they spend millions of tax dollars polling everything and everyone that moves. But dwelling on the furniture and the plumbing of politics misses the whole point of Margaret Thatcher. She had a will of iron. She knew where she was going. She knew who she had to win over. She knew who she had to defeat, and she did not shrink from confrontation. Whether it was the coal miners' union or the howling lefties in the opposition ranks, the nervous Nellies in her own ranks, the dogs of media, the wolves of the Argentine junta, she confronted all of them with determination, even ferocity. Not because she was on an ego trip, but because she was on a mission to get her country, Britain, off its soft, fat, wobbly knees. Britain won the war over Germany and then lost the peace to the left. Churchill was a victor over Hitler and a loser to Labour, who along with their union and media allies butchered Britain to the point where by the time Margaret Thatcher came along in 1979, the self-confidence of the average Brit had been eroded, corroded, and shredded. And that's what happens when unemployment is high and inflation is high and your currency is the laughingstock of the world. That's what happens when unions are striking every single blasted day. And so you can't count on public transport, public mail delivery, public schools, or public anything. The public sector unions had the towns and cities in a vice grip. Even the garbage wasn't being picked up for week after week after week. People in Britain, folks, were seriously worried about the plague, the bubonic plague descending on the British Isles. But then in 1979, the greengrocer's daughter took over, and she faced down her opponents, both on the left and the far right. Yeah, the upper crust, they hated the shopkeeper's daughter. She didn't have the pedigree of a traditional Tory. She did not have nuance and subtlety. She was too brash. But she was the first prime minister to have in peacetime what Churchill had in wartime. She had brass balls, and they delivered rocket fuel to a fine mind, a wit that cut like a knife into the belly of the left-wing beast that Britain had become. She cut government, she cut taxes, and she cut the crap that government is the answer to every question. She felt individuals had a right to their own property and their own destiny. A friend of mine, who happens to be an enormous friend of this audience, Professor Ian Lee, in Ottawa, happens to be an enormous fan of the Iron Lady. Why? Because his dad came from Britain. Why did he leave before World War II? Because Ian Lee's dad knew that if he stayed, he could only ever become a bricklayer. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a bricklayer, says Ian. But the idea that you have to be a bricklayer because your father was a bricklayer and your grandfather and grandfather's grandfather were all bricklayers, meant you were living in a static society, a class society, where the class you're born in is the class you're going to die in. And the only way for his dad to have opportunity was to leave Britain for Canada, to come to the kind of opportunity where it wasn't paralyzed, but it was paralysis in the UK, before the war and after the war. And yes, even by the time Margaret Thatcher got into the driver's seat, it was class paralysis. All the pundits talked to you about how she broke unions and broke a lot of dishes along the way. Well, Margaret Thatcher did a lot more than that. She broke the thick walls that were built up by the upper crust and reinforced by trade unions who benefited from the wall. They didn't mind having their members work as carpenters and bricklayers and garbage collectors all their lives. The aristocratic right and the union left benefited from this opportunity paralysis, this class society. But the shopkeeper's daughter, who never needed a freaking poll to tell what real people in this tasteless class sandwich needed, not just for their stomachs, but for their spirits, because they were several pints down, my friends. She knew that. So she filled their spiritless mugs, and she inspired them by making them believe that Britain could be rebuilt by strong individuals. Once those handcuffs that had been put on them by government and unions and aristocracy were taken off. And so she took them off, not with supple, manicured cuticles. She blew those handcuffs off with a blowtorch. Margaret Thatcher has been and continues to be portrayed by the left as an autocrat. In fact, she was the greatest small d Democrat of our time, and there never will be another in our time. It's not about polls. It's about balls. From this shopkeeper's son to the shopkeeper's daughter, God save the Queen of democracy, free enterprise, and the middle class, Margaret Thatcher. And that's Canadian common sense.